Maureen, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the December 11th, 2025 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As always, thank you for joining us today. The highlights under business and finance are: Federal Reserve officials cut interest rates for a third straight meeting, but signaled they may be done for now, amid unusual divisions over the path forward. Wall Street cheered the central bank's rate cut, lifting the S&P 500 0.7% to within striking distance of a record. The Dow and Nasdaq rose 1% and 0.3% respectively. Powell said that Fed staffers believe that federal data could be overestimating job creation by up to 60,000 positions a month. Blue Origin and SpaceX are competing to take the data center boom into space, developing satellites to provide orbital artificial intelligence computing platforms. Oracle's revenue and operating income for the most recent financial quarter fell slightly short of analyst expectations, and the company raised its spending forecast. Coca-Cola said Chief Executive James Quincy will step down from his role in March and be replaced by Henrik Braun, the company's operating chief. YouTube TV is introducing a slate of genre-specific channel packages in early 2026, offering consumers more flexibility to pick the content they are willing to pay for. Tony DeCopo was named anchor of CBS Evening News, taking over the program as CBS News undergoes a transformation. Trump said that the ownership of CNN should change no matter who succeeds in acquiring Warner Brothers Discovery. Roche said its giredestrant drug cut the risk of breast cancer recurrence or death by 30%, compared with standard of care endocrine therapy. The IMF's managing director urged China to take far greater action to shift its economy toward domestic consumption and away from exports. Instacart shares fell 6% after a report accused the company, also known as Mabel Bear, of pricing identical items differently for different customers. Now for the key articles under the worldwide section. The Trump administration has handed European leaders documents laying out its vision for the rebuilding of Ukraine and the return of Russia to the global economy. European leaders were considering whether to lend Ukraine around half of the $200 billion of frozen Russian assets held in the continent over the next 2 years. The U.S. seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, Trump said, marking an escalation in his pressure campaign against Maduro. The daughter of Nobel laureate Maria Corina Machado collected the Peace Prize for her mother, who was delayed in arriving in Oslo after her clandestine exit from Venezuela. The U.S. plans to screen foreign visitors' social media history for entry including citizens of countries such as the UK and France that are covered by a visa waiver program. Australia imposed its ban on social media for children under 16, dividing opinion on whether it will make anyone safer and is even enforceable. The picture on today's front page shows a young woman surrounded by cameramen and people taking pictures with their cell phones. And that caption reads, "Leaving the country carries the risk that she could be barred from returning." Nobel Peace Laureate Maria Corina Machado greeted supporters in Oslo, Norway, early Thursday after her escape from Venezuela. The article, "Opposition Leader Fled Venezuela for Norway by Land, Sea, and Air," by Jose de Cordoba, Vera Bergengruen, and Alex Leary. Wearing a wig and a disguise, Maria Corina Machado began her escape from Venezuela on Monday afternoon. The Venezuelan opposition leader was trying to get to Norway by Wednesday in time to receive the Nobel Peace Prize she won for challenging the country's authoritarian leader, Nicolas Maduro. After finally arriving in Oslo, Machado stood on the balcony of the city's Central Grand Hotel early Thursday and waved to supporters. They yelled "Valiente," Spanish for brave, and sang the Venezuelan national anthem. Before she could make the trip, Machado had to get from the Caracas suburb where she has been in hiding for a year to a coastal fishing village where a skiff awaited her. Over the course of 10 nerve-wracking hours, Machado and 2 people helping her escape hit 10 military checkpoints, avoiding capture each time before she reached the coast by midnight, a person close to the operation said. She rested for a few hours, the person said, before the next leg of her journey, a perilous trip across the open Caribbean Sea to Curacao. She and her 2 companions set out on a wooden fishing skiff at 5 a.m., the person said, with strong winds and choppy seas slowing them down. She had almost completed an escape that had been in the works for about 2 months and was carried out by a Venezuelan network that has helped other people to flee the country, the people said. The group made an important call before they set out to the U.S. military, warning them of the vessel's occupants to avoid the kind of airstrike that has hit more than 20 other similar vessels in the past 3 months, killing more than 80 people. We coordinated that she was going to leave by a specific area so that they would not blow up the boat, the person close to the operation said. The Trump administration was aware of the operation, but the extent of its involvement was unclear. The U.S. Navy and the Pentagon declined to comment. Administration officials denied the accuracy of the military contact. Around the same time of their crossing, a pair of U.S. Navy F-18s flew into the Gulf of Venezuela and spent roughly 40 minutes flying in tight circles near the route that would lead from the coast to Curacao, according to flight tracking data. It was the closest incursion of U.S. aircraft into Venezuelan airspace since the U.S. military buildup began in September. Machado arrived in Curacao around 3 p.m. Tuesday. She was met by a private contractor who specialized in extractions and was supplied by the Trump administration. the person said. Exhausted by the long trip, Machado checked into a hotel and stayed overnight, the person said. As the sun rose in Curacao and as guests began to gather in Oslo, an executive jet provided by a Miami associate took off from the island and headed for the Norwegian capital after making a stop in Bangor, Maine, the person said. Before boarding the aircraft, Machado recorded a short audio message thanking so many people who risked their lives so that she could leave Venezuela. Her escape was kept so closely held that the Nobel Institute told Norwegian media it didn't know where she was as the award ceremony in Oslo began. Jorgen Watten Friednes, the chair of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, told the award ceremony that she had been through a journey in a situation of extreme danger. Machado's daughter, Ana Corina Sosa Machado, accepted the award on her behalf on Wednesday. She will be back in Venezuela very soon, she told the audience, which included the U.S. lawmakers, international supporters, and foreign leaders. Machado had been living in a completely isolated place and wasn't eating well. She plans to rest in Oslo for about a week before making a tour of European countries to drum up support for the Venezuelan cause. Eventually, she will also visit Washington, the person who talks frequently with Machado said. On Wednesday evening, as her supporters and foreign officials sat down for a 5-course dinner in the banquet hall of Oslo's Grand Hotel, details of Machado's escape circulated among the guests, U.S. and Venezuelan attendees said. In Caracas, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez accused Machado and the opposition of working to advance U.S. imperialist interest to loot Venezuela's oil and mineral wealth. Venezuelan opposition activists said having Machado out of Venezuela will energize their cause, allowing the charismatic opposition leader to more effectively lobby foreign governments than she could from a remote video connection, and push for more economic and political pressure on Maduro. Fed cuts rates, signals a pause. Trim is third straight as officials split over whether to target inflation or jobs. By Nick Timiraeus. Federal Reserve officials cut interest rates for a third straight meeting, but signaled they may be done for now, amid unusual divisions over the path forward. The decision Wednesday to reduce the benchmark federal funds rate by a quarter point to between 3.5 and 3.75%, a 3-year low, is aimed at protecting against a sharper than anticipated slowdown in hiring. The Fed voted 9-3, the first time in 6 years that 3 officials cast dissents. 2 officials thought the reduction wasn't warranted, while another favored a larger half-point cut. With progress on inflation stalled, officials had indicated in the run-up to this week's decision that further reductions could require evidence of labor market deterioration. We're well positioned to wait and see how the economy evolves from here, Fed Chair Jerome Powell said at a news conference. On Wednesday, their painstakingly calibrated post-meeting statement signaled a higher bar to additional cuts by echoing a similar pivot after cutting rates 1 year ago. Still, Powell defended the decision to cut now rather than wait until the Fed's next meeting in late January, when it will have significantly more data that had been delayed due to this fall's government shutdown. Wall Street cheered the rate cut in part because Powell didn't sound as opposed to additional rate cuts as some had feared before the meeting. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Europe-U.S. clash on future of Ukraine after war. The clash is now not just about borders, but increasingly about business. Trump wants access to frozen Russian assets and to bring Moscow in from the cold. By Joe Parkinson, Benoit Falcon, and Drew Hinshaw. The Trump administration in recent weeks has handed its European counterparts a series of documents, each a single page, laying out its vision for the reconstruction of Ukraine and the return of Russia to the global economy. The proposals have sparked an intense battle at the negotiating table between the U.S. and its traditional allies in Europe. The outcome stands to profoundly alter the economic map of the continent. The U.S. blueprint has been spelled out in appendices to current peace proposals that aren't public, but were described to the Wall Street Journal by U.S. and European officials. The documents detail plans for U.S. financial firms and other businesses to tap roughly $200 billion of frozen Russian assets for projects in Ukraine, including a massive new data center to be powered by a nuclear plant currently occupied by Russian troops. Another appendix offers the U.S.'s broad vision for bringing Russia's economy in from the cold, with U.S. companies investing in strategic sectors from rare earth extraction to drilling for oil in the Arctic, and helping to restore Russian energy flows to Western Europe and the rest of the world. Some European officials who have seen the document said they weren't sure whether to take some of the U.S. proposals seriously. One official compared them to President Trump's vision of building a Riviera-style development in Gaza. Another, referring to the proposed U.S.-Russia energy deals, said it was an economic version of the 1945 conference where World War II victors divvied up Europe. A White House official said Trump and his team were working to strike a deal to end the war. In a call on Wednesday, Trump discussed the peace process with French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Europe, which has sought to wean itself from Russian gas since Moscow's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, to starve the Kremlin's war chest and reduce its own reliance on a strategic rival, is loath to resume energy purchases from a country it sees as its biggest security threat. European officials want to use the same frozen Russian funds held in European institutions to extend a loan to Ukraine's cash-strapped government so it can buy weapons it needs to defend itself and keep operating as its coffers run dry. The clash at the negotiating table is now not just about borders, but increasingly about business, and in a twist, pits not just Russia against Ukraine, but also the U.S. against its traditional allies in Europe. The journal first reported that U.S. companies with close ties to the Trump administration were positioning themselves to profit from the U.S. plan. The German government has been at pains to explain that European sanctions ban any work or financial transactions connected to fixing or reusing Nord Stream, which Ukrainian operatives sabotaged in 2022. European officials say they fear the U.S. approach will give Russia the reprieve it needs to rev up its economy and make itself militarily stronger. A new assessment by a Western intelligence agency, reviewed by the journal, said Russia has technically been in recession for 6 months and that the challenges of running its war economy while trying to control prices are presenting a systemic risk to its banking sector. If the U.S. vision prevails, it will override Europe's own plans to shore up Ukraine's wartime government and further cement Russia's economic isolation. The result is what several officials described as a frenzied race to move ahead before the U.S. imposes its own arrangements. U.S. officials involved in the negotiations say Europe's approach would quickly deplete the frozen funds. Washington, on the other hand, would tap Wall Street executives and private equity billionaires to invest the money and expand the amount available to invest. One official involved in the talks said the pot could grow to $800 billion under American management. Our sensibility is that we really understand financial growth, the official said. On Wednesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he had held productive conversations with the investment firm BlackRock's chief executive, Larry Fink. The U.S. negotiating team sees shared economic activity and energy interdependence as the cornerstone of its business for peace philosophy. Ukrainian data centers would draw power from the currently Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, Europe's largest, for example. Merz said on Monday at a meeting at 10 Downing Street with Zelensky and the leaders of France and the UK that he was skeptical about the U.S. proposals. Massive Takeovers Return Powered by Debt by Matt Wertz and Ben Glickman. The mega deal is back, and so is Wall Street's immense appetite for debt. Paramount's hostile bid for Warner Brothers Discovery this week, the leveraged buyout of gaming company Electronic Arts earlier this year, and other recent debt-laden transactions have all been possible thanks to an increase in lending by banks and even some private credit funds. Big-ticket mergers and acquisitions, or those valued at $10 billion or more, hit a record dollar amount this year, according to Deal Logic. Much of the price tag on those deals gets paid for with debt. Debt-heavy deals mean large paydays for shareholders, but also more risk for bond investors when credit markets are showing signs of overexuberance, and would-be acquirers have more choices than ever. The corporate bond, syndicated loan, and private credit markets are all whirling at the same time. These big, bolder bets are becoming more interesting, and people are willing to try them because of the financing that's available, said Matthew Toole, Director of Deals Intelligence at the London Stock Exchange Group. Expectations that the Trump administration will be more accommodating to large tie-ups are also pumping the size of deals up to record levels. Paramount's offer for Warner included $54 billion in committed debt financing from the Bank of America, Citigroup, and the investment firm Apollo Global Management. Netflix's deal with Warner's features $59 billion in debt, backed by Wells Fargo, BNP Paribas, and HSBC. Those 2026 buyouts are sure to add to a debt pile that is already high enough to leave some bond investors feeling queasy. U.S. seizes an oil tanker off Venezuela. Ship was sanctioned over ties to an illicit trade network, Attorney General says. By Shelby Holliday, Costas Paris, and Colin Eaton. The U.S. seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, President Trump said Wednesday, marking a major escalation in the administration's pressure campaign against the country's leader, Nicolas Maduro. The move came hours after Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado sneaked out of the country on a boat, an escape that potentially gave the Trump administration an opening to take more aggressive action against the Maduro regime. We've just seized a tanker on the coast of Venezuela, a large tanker, very large, Trump said Wednesday. Attorney General Pam Bondi said the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Homeland Security Investigations, and U.S. Coast Guard executed a seizure warrant for the tanker with support from the Defense Department. In a video she posted on social media, uniformed men can be seen fast roping onto the ship from helicopters and entering the bridge with guns raised. For multiple years, the oil tanker has been sanctioned by the U.S. due to its involvement in an illicit oil shipping network supporting foreign terrorist organizations, Bondi wrote on social media. The vessel had been used to transport sanctioned oil from Venezuela and Iran, she said. In a statement, the Venezuelan government called the seizure blatant theft and an act of piracy. It accused Trump of seeking to seize Venezuelan oil and plunder the country's energy resources. A Pentagon official said the move was a warning to other tankers waiting to dock and load up Venezuelan crude. Maritime tracking data show around a dozen off the Venezuelan coast, but the official said others have their automatic identification systems turned off to avoid detection. The U.S. has sanctions in place that prohibit companies from trading Venezuelan oil, but it has given exemptions to some companies, including Chevron. Trump has warned that he will put hefty tariffs on countries that buy oil from Venezuela. Plans to honor abolition with coins scrapped by Richard Rubin. The Trump administration jettisoned a plan to honor the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, and the civil rights movement on quarters for the nation's 250th birthday. Those themes were part of a proposed 5-quarter special series that went through years of debate and design, but was never officially announced by the U.S. Mint. They were replaced with images inspired by the Mayflower Compact, the Revolutionary War, and the Gettysburg Address. Instead of Frederick Douglass, a woman's suffrage marcher, and Ruby Bridges desegregating an elementary school, the Mint's special quarters for 2026 will feature Presidents George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and James Madison, along with pilgrims glimpsing American shores. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, Trump says, "Ships ahoy" to Xi Jinping. Why is he giving an adversary access to advanced AI chips? President Trump said this week he will let NVIDIA sell its H200 chip to China in return for the U.S. Treasury getting a 25% cut of the sales. The Indians struck a better deal when they sold Manhattan to the Dutch. Why would the president give away one of America's chief technological advantages to an adversary and its chief economic competitor? Mr. Trump's move to ease export controls on computer chips illustrates his confusing China policy, to the extent he has one. In the first term, he changed America's China debate as a trade and security hawk. 8 years later, he's sounding like the post-Cold War globalist he denounces, who thought the lure of commerce would make the world safer. The U.S. artificial intelligence lead owes largely to its advantage in computing power. China's best AI chips are behind those designed by NVIDIA, though how far behind is debatable. Most say it's 18 to 24 months, but for now the U.S. exceeds China in AI computing power. One reason is that Beijing's semiconductor industrial policy has resulted in colossal waste and corruption. China's national champion Huawei has struggled designing high-powered chips, which are needed to train advanced AI models. This, in turn, has frustrated Beijing's ambitions to dominate biotech, quantum computing, and military power. The charges that the Justice Department unveiled this week against Chinese businessmen for allegedly smuggling NVIDIA's H200 chips underscores their strategic importance. They are designed to process massive amounts of data, advancing generative AI and large language models, and accelerating scientific computing. These GPUs are used for both civilian and military applications, the press release says. Yet now, Mr. Trump wants to sell the advanced H200 without strings? The question is, why? NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang has lobbied for loosening the restrictions. The company's friends in the White House argue that doing so could retard China's drive to develop competing chips and make its AI developers dependent on U.S. chips. That's their best argument. But Beijing isn't subsidizing homegrown competitors, so it can depend on U.S. technology. China knows it trails the U.S. in AI, and that lack of unlimited access to NVIDIA's H200 chips has hindered Chinese AI developers like DeepSeek. Xi Jinping wants H200s so DeepSeek and others can close the gap with Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, and U.S. companies. By the way, the biggest hindrance for American AI developers is a shortage of computing power. Letting NVIDIA sell advanced chips to China means there is less compute, as the techies say, for U.S. firms, especially startups. Mr. Trump wrote on Truth Social that easing export controls on the H200 won't hurt NVIDIA's U.S. customers since they are already moving forward with their incredible, highly advanced Blackwell chips, and soon Rubin. It's true, NVIDIA's new Blackwell and forthcoming Rubin chips are in high demand. But U.S. AI developers are buying any AI chips they can get. This is why OpenAI struck a chip deal with Advanced Micro Devices in October. Meta is looking to buy chips from Google, a competitor in other domains. There's also nothing to stop Beijing from commanding DeepSeek or other Chinese companies to use Chinese-made chips in the future, if and when they improve. AI developers can also mix and match technology stacks, similar to how businesses do with software. And don't discount that Chinese chip makers will figure out how to rip off NVIDIA's technology. Maybe the president figures the Chinese will eventually copy or catch up to NVIDIA's H200, so we might as well let NVIDIA make money before that happens. Sophisticated multinational smuggling rings are helping Chinese companies evade export controls, as Justice says. But the controls have worked well enough that President Xi Jinping still views NVIDIA chips as a high priority. We sure hope Mr. Trump isn't doing this for NVIDIA's 25% tax payments to Treasury. The Constitution vests taxing power in Congress, yet Mr. Trump is essentially trading national security for pennies on the dollar. In August, the administration let NVIDIA sell its H200 chip to China, conditioned on Treasury getting a 15% cut. At least the administration then claimed China had agreed to ease rare earth magnet controls in return, only for Beijing to ratchet up restrictions on rare earth exports again in October, before the Xi-Trump trade truce a few weeks later. What is Mr. Trump getting from Beijing now, besides better mood music, before his planned visit to China in the spring? Europe is failing Ukraine on military aid. As President Trump pushes for a negotiated end to Russia's war in Ukraine, Europe worries it's being left on the margins. Yet, if the continent's politicians want to be pivotal in the conversation about Kyiv's future, why does a new report show lagging European military aid to Ukraine? Mr. Trump has moved away from U.S. arms donations to Ukraine, shifting instead toward weapons sales, which has left Kyiv more dependent on Europe. Yet between September 1st and October 31st, Europe allocated less than $5 billion in new military aid, far too little to offset the halt in U.S. support, says an analyst by the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, a German research group. This year, Ukraine's partners worldwide have allocated less than $39 billion in military aid, according to the latest tally, which runs through October. Barring an end-of-year surge, 2025 will be the year with the lowest level of new military aid allocations ever for Ukraine since the outbreak of the full-scale invasion in 2022, says Christoph Trebesch, the head of Kiel's Ukraine Support Tracker Initiative. Kyiv is making do with less, even as Moscow's attacks intensify. Last month, Russia launched some 5,444 long-range drones at Ukraine, up from 2,434 in November 2024. Ukraine has improved its indigenous production of arms and air defenses, yet it remains reliant on some U.S. systems, including the Patriot systems it uses to counter ballistic missiles. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte last week urged allies to accelerate our contributions to the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PURL, which coordinates purchases of American weaponry for Kyiv. The Kiel report also underlines the debate in Europe about using a reparations loan to mobilize frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine. This money could go toward much-needed weapons. Vladimir Putin respects strength. In his fashion, so does Mr. Trump. If Europe doesn't want Russia to win, it has to act like it. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the opinion pages, the era of illegal student loan forgiveness is over. A joint settlement, combined with reforms, marks the end of unlawful debt cancellation schemes. By Nicholas Kent and Catherine Hanaway. The U.S. Education Department has agreed to a settlement with the state of Missouri, which sued the government in 2024 over the Biden administration's illegal student loan forgiveness. There's a serious debate to be had about student loans ballooning out of control. But Democratic politicians have made impossible promises based on illegal maneuvers. Instead of working toward policy reforms to ensure colleges and universities deliver education at a reasonable cost, Democrats churned out debt forgiveness plans and insisted they could cancel student loans unilaterally. Nationally, borrowers owe nearly $1.7 trillion in student loans. President Biden gave way to pressure from radicals when he purported to cancel a substantial portion of the outstanding balance. In doing so, he, or perhaps his auto pen, flouted the law and tried to saddle taxpayers, many of whom didn't attend college or paid their own way, with billions in student debt. Missouri first challenged these attempts at mass student loan forgiveness in 2022. Multiple federal courts held that the administration's forgiveness plans were illegal. After losing at the Supreme Court in 2023, the Biden administration doubled down on mass loan forgiveness by loading existing income-driven repayment plans with terms that would make loan forgiveness inevitable. The University of Pennsylvania Wharton School budget models estimated that this would cost taxpayers $342 billion over 10 years. This income-driven repayment program, the SAVE plan allowed undergraduate borrowers to make monthly payments equal to 5% of discretionary income, which was defined as that portion of their income above 2.25 times the federal poverty line. The plan dramatically shortened the forgiveness timeline for borrowers with less than $12,000 in debt. SAVE was so generous that more than 9 out of 10 borrowers repaying through an income-driven repayment plan were expected to use it. Nearly 2/3 of them were expected to receive loan forgiveness within 20 years. The average borrower would have repaid about 2/3 of what he borrowed, and 4.5 million of the 8 million SAVE borrowers would have had a monthly payment of $0. The SAVE plan was equivalent to a full cancellation for millions of borrowers, and again, everyday Americans would have been left to foot the bill. 17 states joined Missouri in fighting the SAVE plan, a clearly illegal trick to conjure loan forgiveness out of thin air. Under the Trump administration, the Education Department has worked with Missouri to settle the case in court and is proposing to end the plan by not enrolling new borrowers, denying pending applications, and moving all borrowers to legal repayment plans. If a federal judge approves the parties' joint settlement, it will end Mr. Biden's illegal student loan bailout. The Biden administration unfairly strung borrowers along for 4 years, making promises it couldn't keep. As Nancy Pelosi acknowledged in 2021, forgiving student loans is a policy call for Congress, not something the president can do by fiat. The Trump administration isn't blind to the mounting student debt burden or the skyrocketing cost of a college degree, but we refuse to force hardworking Americans to bear the burden of loans that aren't theirs. Setting a mass loan forgiveness precedent would be deeply unfair and would entice future college students to take out larger loans. It would also give colleges a strong incentive to raise tuition. The Trump administration, with Missouri's help, is delivering long-term solutions rather than illegal bailouts. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act creates a single new income-driven repayment plan, the Repayment Assistance Plan, which will be available next summer. The administration has pursued other policies that will help borrowers repay their loans and put downward pressure on tuition. Borrowers must begin repaying their student loans. Even if they face financial challenges, there are repayment plans that are affordable and take income into account when calculating monthly payments. By enrolling in a plan that fits their situation, borrowers can avoid the costly consequences of delinquency and default, such as interest capitalization, damage to credit scores, collection actions, and losing eligibility for future student aid. If the parties' joint settlement gets judicial approval, a new era for student loans will begin. The end of unlawful debt cancellation schemes, combined with these reforms, will keep tuition costs from rising exponentially and will restore the principle that loans must be paid back. Mr. Kent is U.S. Undersecretary of Education. Ms. Hanaway is Missouri's Attorney General. How isolationist are Trump's voters? The public, including Republicans, still favors Reagan's view on foreign policy. By Karl Rove. The newly released White House National Security Strategy raises again the question whether Americans are turning isolationist. A recent poll suggests they aren't. Every year since 2013, the country's top military commanders, U.S. officials, leaders from the defense industry, and many of the country's best minds on foreign policy and national security have gathered at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in California. There they examine our country's defense posture and discuss our dangerous world, including, in recent years, a poll conducted by the Ronald Reagan Institute of Americans' Foreign Policy Views. The 2025 survey produced some surprising results. 64% of Americans believe it's better for the U.S. to be more engaged and take the lead. Only 33% think it's better for the country to be less engaged and merely react to events. The partisan breakout was also counterintuitive. 79% of self-identified MAGA Republicans and 57% of Democrats supported greater U.S. engagement. Nor are Americans turning their backs on Europe and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. 68% view NATO favorably, the highest share since the Reagan Institute began polling in 2018. Even more, 76% support U.S. military force if a NATO ally is attacked, up from 71% in June. Most Americans, 59%, oppose withdrawing from NATO. Only 34% support leaving, and 1 in 5 withdrawal supporters changed their minds after being told NATO allies are increasing military spending. There's also widespread agreement about the significance of America having the world's most powerful military. 87% of respondents agreed that it's important, and 71% believe the world is more likely to achieve peace when the U.S. has the strongest military globally. 64% felt the U.S. military should be large enough to fight simultaneous wars against China and other adversaries, either Russia or a smaller enemy such as Iran or North Korea. Americans are clear-eyed about who our adversaries are. Nearly half say China is the greatest threat, followed by Russia at 26%. Increased cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea concerns 87% of respondents and 50% strongly concerned. By 62% to 11%, Americans want Ukraine to win its war against Russia, including 57% of Republicans and 72% of Democrats. Support for selling weapons to Europe to give to Ukraine is even higher, at 68%, with Republicans at 75% and Democrats at 67%. Only 28% of respondents would trust Russia to honor any peace agreement, while 70% would distrust it. Because of concerns about China, support for Taiwan is growing. 77% of voters, including 81% of Republicans and 78% of Democrats, say the country is important for the U.S. The poll revealed a concerning decline in support for Israel. Last year, 72% of respondents saw it as an ally. That share has fallen to 66%, where it was in 2021, after that year's 12-day Hamas-Israel conflict. Americans are largely skeptical that the ceasefire with Hamas will hold, and support for sending arms to Israel is only at 50%. But a majority, 54%, would back further Israeli military action if Hamas refuses to disarm. Perhaps most troubling, Americans are concerned about our military's ability to get the job done. 54% said they have high confidence that our military can keep the country safe, but only 49% have high confidence it could win a war overseas. Most worrying, only 45% felt it could deter foreign aggression. That should concern Washington. Great powers that can't prevent war too often find themselves forced to fight one. Some populist, Putin apologist, and neo-isolationist push for America to withdraw from the world and simply ignore the consequences that would follow from our adversaries advancing around the globe. Clearly, that's not where Americans are. The public falls closer to President Reagan's views than those often espoused by President Trump, or at least by his more isolationist advisors. Mr. Trump would be wise to learn from his predecessor, one of history's greatest Republicans, whose foreign policy principles are embraced by a majority of the GOP's base. Even MAGA Republicans turn out to be fairly Reaganite after all. The Pepper and Salt cartoon shows a couple seated at a table talking, and he says, "Let me just start with an apology and see where that takes us." You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from December 11th, 2025 issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from the Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful weekend.